Now, welcome back to the programme. You're with the Richie Allen Show on the People's Voice. Always good to have your company. Now, in June 1984, Indian Army troops with tanks, artillery, helicopters, armoured vehicles and chemical weapons attacked the holy site of the Golden Temple at Amritsar, where Sikh militants had been holding up. 220 Indian soldiers, and between, this is official now, this is what they say officially, between 492 and 3,000 civilians died in that operation. Thousands more died in the unrest that followed, and 4 months later, the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by 2 of her Sikh bodyguards. The massacre is back in the news this week after documents accidentally released under the 30-year rule by the UK National Archives revealed that a British SAS officer advised on the operation. Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government agreed to send that same advisor. The move was considered good for the bilateral relationship at a time of potential arms sales, this according to a report released this week by the Cabinet Secretary Jeremy Haywood. Now, Singh of the Sikh Federation UK believes the full extent of British involvement in the massacre needs to be told, and I'm delighted to say he joins us in the studio. Jazz, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Jazz, for our global viewers who might not remember this, set the backdrop to what happened exactly that day. What happened and why did it happen?
So in terms of the battle, it's a fairly complex issue, but essentially the Sikhs, who are predominantly in the north and the Punjab region, represent about 2% of India's population. And the whole issue was around civil rights, civil equality in the Indian state. Sikhs weren't recognised as a religious community, and they were forced to live under the Hindu majority constitution. And that's created a wave of awareness within young Sikhs and Sikh population across India, and wanted that freedom. And it was basic freedoms around the language protection, water rights, electricity rights, things like that. Now, this created more pressure within the government to think, actually, we need to quash the sentiments of the Sikhs here. And it's led to...
Now, was the whole government behind that? I mean, did Indira Gandhi have the support of all the government?
I think there was a number of people in the government that warned against it. I mean, the primary reason being that the city Harmandir Sahib, which is often known as the Golden Temple, is probably one of the most iconic religious shrines in the world.
It's beautiful there.
And for any plan or any thought to enter that with armed forces would have huge risk. So I think a lot of people would have advised against it, but I think it's her decision in terms of why she did, and still today it's unbelievable that she actually did and carried out with it.
Yeah, I mean, it was global news when it happened. And we said there, you know, records say between 492 and 3,000, but it's on the upper scale of people.
It was. I mean, it's very difficult to find official figures. And one data point that often is referred to from a human aspect is the attack was orchestrated on the busiest day of the Sikh calendar. So it's effectively like, the only example we can think of is the Italian government army invading and bombing the Vatican on Easter, because it was the martyrdom day of a fifth guru who laid the foundation stone of the temple. So it's heavily busy. And in terms of some of the news that broke is that, and it's a personal story from family friends from our village back home, is that there was nearly 8,000 shoes, because you remove your shoes when you go into the Sikh temple, that were just uncollected at the time once the army invasion
that tells the story, doesn't it?
And I know people in our village in India actually cremated and read the final rites on their shoes, because it's the only thing they had left. My uncle and his nephew went to the Golden Temple to pay their respects and never returned. So that's some of the personal stories and the tragedy of this event.
Now, Jazz, at the time, was there any suspicion at all that the Indian government were taking advice on this, or you know, had in fact been in touch with the British government, with Downing Street in effect? I
mean, as the attack happened and people started to release information, there were certain journalists, because there was a media blackout at the time. So the whole plan in the run-up to the invasion was a curfew was put across Amritsar in the north of Punjab. All media personnel, international and national, were all expelled out of the region, and there was a complete media blackout. Tele lines and were all cut. So it was planned that they wanted to keep this hush-hush. And the attempts, they sent in commandos, and they were met with resistance from the Sikhs, because that was the call that anyone attacking the temple, we would defend it for our lives, and that's in our religion. It's not only the religious centre, but it's also the political centre of our religion. So any attempt to invade was met small pockets of resistance. I mean, I think it was 15,000 troops were sent with heavy artillery, tanks.
We mentioned chemical weapons.
And all sorts, and gas was used. And there was a handful of dissidents or Sikhs that were defending the temple. So just in terms of the disproportionate level of force that was used, and tanks actually then were used on the 5th of June, night the 5th of June, to just completely bombard the temple and destroy the temple. And that's just half the story. And what really compounded the fact is that operation continued. There are widely reports from independent news channels whereby eyewitness accounts actually saw Sikh men laid out in the pakarma, which is the area around the temple, the complex, with their turbans removed. They were used to tie their hands behind their backs, and they were shot point blank range.
Executed, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that, along with the amount of bodies that were just dumped into the municipal trucks were used to clear out, garbage trucks were used to clear out bodies, and the huge cremation sites were done to try and cover up the massacre that occurred. And to this day, we still don't know the full truth. And these documents coming out, it is the 30th anniversary of that event this year.
And 2014, yeah.
Absolutely. And there was rumours that the British were involved, certain elements had covered it, but there was never any fact. And there was never any true proof of that. And this revelation of these documents coming out has really been shocking.
Shall we quote David Cameron, the British Prime Minister? So, excuse me, he said he wanted the dialogue between the government and the Sikh community over this issue to continue. He said, British Sikhs have made and continue to make a vital contribution to our national life. 30 years ago, he said, David Cameron, a great tragedy unfolded in Amritsar. Many lives were lost and the scars, in the Sikh community still run deep. I tasked the Cabinet Secretary with getting to the truth, it's Jeremy Haywood. He did so, and there were two main findings. One, around 4 months before the events, at the request of the Indian government, a single, he says, UK military officer provided some advice, but critically, this advice wasn't followed and it was a one-off. Two, he says, there is absolutely no evidence of UK government involvement in the operation itself.
Yeah, and this is the issue, is that David Cameron, Prime Minister of the UK government, came out very quickly and made a statement that he would look into this matter with urgency, with transparency, and to get to the truth. That was his words. And the Sikh community welcomed that, although speed isn't the ultimate priority for us, because we've been waiting 30 years. The actual priority was completeness of the truth. And from the Sikh community, the Sikh Federation, along with others, were invited to a meeting with Jeremy Haywood to understand his terms of reference. And this was 3 weeks after the report had been initiated, so it was quite late on.
Yeah.
And in that meeting, we discovered that the terms of reference were very limited. So 1984, and the attack, Operation Blue Star, is one incident. That then led on, as you mentioned at the start, to various other incidents, predominantly the Sikh genocide in November '84, following the assassination of Indira Gandhi, over 4 days of mass violence and killings in the streets of Delhi. But then also further suppression of Sikhs' liberties across the Punjab. So to take one aspect of that in isolation and just look at it purely from a governmental involvement perspective was always going to be limited and never going to satisfy the Sikhs and the community around in terms of the bigger issue.
Now tell me about the international reaction to it at the time. Jazz, what was the reaction of the international community to all this when it happened?
So I think Sikhs globally protested and not only shocked but just disbelief that this could happen. I mean, it's 1984, but it's only 30 years ago. It's not hundreds of years ago. No. And it's just sheer belief that the Sikhs, who represent, although they're 2% of the population, represent 10% of the Indian army, have given huge, disproportionate level of sacrifices for India in the past. To think that the state and the government would do this was just unbelievable. And I think internationally as well, the issue was picked up. And the questions that we raised is we've been lobbying British Parliament for the last 30 years to look into the truth with Amnesty International and other human rights groups. And the response we've always had from the government is that the UK government cannot involve or get involved with the affairs of another state. And that's been the textbook response for us for 30 years. And actually, what these documents highlight is actually you can, and they have done.
And they have done, yeah.
And not only involve in the affairs of a different state, actually help, assist, plan a coordinated attack on a religious shrine, knowing you have a huge Sikh community in Britain. and actually being aware of that and stating the letters that this needs to be hush-hush.
And there's an arms trade aspect to all this. I mean, talk about that. I mean,
So-
what Britain stood to gain by.
Absolutely, and this comes down to the relationship with India and Britain at the time, and what was that whole relationship like economically, socially. And Tom Watson, MP, who uncovered went through the documents and uncovered the Westland helicopter deal that was going through at the time. And there is letters in there that the British High Commission in India has wrote back to the Foreign Office saying it would be very, very helpful for bilateral agreements that we give this advice, and it would be frowned upon effectively by Indira Gandhi if we weren't to comply with the request.
Yeah.
Now, no document, and Foreign Secretary William Hague came and said that there was no evidence or substantial link, but let's be honest, they're never going to write that in a document that we must do it because the deal will go sour. But I think if you look at this...
It's about probabilities, Jazz, isn't it?
Absolutely. And
Ultimately,
to the same extent, there isn't evidence to say that it wasn't linked. Because then what else was that bilateral agreement based on? And it was the social and the economic climate at the time that those decisions were based on.
You know, the aftermath of something like that, how difficult must it have been for Sikhs within India to live in the country after that? I mean, because they must have been living with an enormous amount of rage and injustice at what happened. But they still had to live there. I can never understand that, Jazz.
And they still are.
And they still are.
So the issue is, and people sometimes say, time to sort of move on and forget. But some of the statements and the propaganda and the media controlled by the state, what they were putting out was information that any Sikh, male factors, wearing the religious garb, which is the turban, the kirpan, so they are terrorists and extremists. So that was the language being used. And this continued for decades in India and Punjab and resulted in the genocide in November. I mean, what must go through and what must influence an individual who can go out and go and murder their neighbour and their family just for being Sikh and having no relation or connection to the actual assassination. So that was the mindset that was put out in the media through all of the channels. And that's what influenced it. And Sikhs are still living against that today. And that image and that portrayal of Sikhs impacted the British government in terms of their reaction of how they dealt with British Sikhs. And this is again, which is revealed in the papers, is that not only did, if we look at the issue, there's three. First of all, why was advice given? Less concerned with the request for advice.
Yeah, why was it given?
William Hague talked about that a lot, but we're not bothered why it was asked. We're concerned with why was it given.
Remind me of who the Foreign Secretary, it wasn't Douglas Hurd, was it?
No, it was Geoffrey Howe.
So Geoffrey Howe, of course. So he would have been the Foreign Secretary of the day. I mean, that's where the answers lie.
Yeah, so the questions we have outstanding from the government are, why was the advice given? Knowing that it's a hugely religious shrine, and there is likely to be a backlash and uprising in Sikhs in the UK. Okay, you may have given some advice that limit the civilian casualties. We don't know what that advice is. They refer to it and paraphrase some of the advice, but it's not come out. So that's one. But knowing then the attack happened in the 5th of June, the British government were made aware of that. They then knew the scale of the attack, the severity of the force used and the loss of life in the temple. So knowing that, the reaction of the government, which is so disappointing at the time, was to actually use the same terminology to classify Sikhs in the UK. So there was actually a clampdown on British Sikhs protesting in London. And there is cabinet secretary filed minutes now that have come to light, which actually, on the behest of the Indian government, the British government actually banned a religious procession in November. And the procession was actually to mark the birth of Guru Nanak, our first guru. But because it was around November, they actually requested the government to put pressure on the Met to actually ban, and that procession was banned. So here you have a foreign state, not only interfering in the affairs of the British state, but also affecting the religious freedom of British citizens.
You have to wonder, now that Margaret Thatcher has passed on, why it's so difficult for them to come out and apologise for it and acknowledge it.
And again, I want to be absolutely clear that this doesn't replace India with Britain as the guilty and the culprits for this.
Yeah.
It's the complicity aspect. So now you can no longer say we don't interfere, therefore we can't do anything about it. the complicity factor now, like I was admitted in the Commons on Wednesday that we were involved and we did give advice. I think as Sikhs, as British Sikhs, what we're actually asking for is we live in Britain. We have given countless sacrifices for Britain. Over 80,000 Sikhs died in both world wars for the liberty and freedom of Britain. And we're part of the fabric and economic and social society in the UK. And it's been recognised by the British government. And we're very proud of being British. But now what we're asking for, having learned these revelations, that we want now the British government to honour and they're obliged to get to the truth on behalf of us. Not only because Britain is the largest democracy and it stands for freedom and liberty, but they owe it to us as British Sikhs to get to the truth and have this issue on the international level where other member states can actually debate the issue and bring India to the table to finally get to the truth of 1984 and give some kind of restitution to the Sikh community.
Charles, I want to thank you for coming in. Thanks a lot. It's a big story that we'll keep on top of it. Thank you very much. That was Singh there from the UK, excuse me, from the Sikh Federation UK.